To get a wide, thick, and dense back, you need to cover 4 main movement patterns to grow all parts of your back effectively. And the first one we'll be covering today is the frontal plane pull. This is simply a vertical pull with a wider grip. With this type of exercise, we're covering the first of the 2 main functions of the lats, shoulder adduction. It is old school wisdom that you need to grip wide to get wide. Primarily, you're hitting the iliac and lumbar division of the lats. So when it comes to when the lats or the specific regions of the lats that I mentioned have the best leverage or where they can produce the most force, which resistance profile is the best for them, we want to pick an exercise which involves peak forces between 65 and 75 degrees of shoulder elevation, which will be the most effective for training the lats. Simplified, that exercise should have peak forces or should be the hardest in the shortened or contracted position. Take the widest grip possible. Stay as upright as possible. This will hit the lats maximally. Avoid kipping or excessive arching, or the stimulus of the exercise will spill over to the whole back. When performing this exercise, don't just mindlessly pull yourself up. Really focus on driving your arms into your armpits, adducting your arm into your body as hard as possible. Don't completely lock out your arms at the top and keep the scapula in place. For the lats, you don't want to protract and retract your scapula or get an excessive stretch at the top, as the lats have the best leverage to produce force and get the most stimulus therefore in the shortened position, and at the top, in the stretch portion of the movement, a whole bunch of other muscle groups and even your pecs take over the movement. The lats don't only do shoulder adduction, but also shoulder extension. And for this, we need to cover that function with the sagittal pull. For the sagittal pull, we need to pick exercises with a tight arm path, and they can be slightly vertical or horizontal. The specific regions of the lats we're hitting with this exercise are the thoracic or upper lat and the lumbar or middle lat. You get more activation of the thoracic or upper lat at 60 degrees of shoulder elevation, which means that for the upper lats, you want to pick a more slightly vertical variation of a sagittal pull, which means to get more middle lat activation compared to upper lat, you want to stick in the more horizontal or row type sagittal plane. Optimally, you would want to pick an exercise that has peak forces between 30 and 60 degrees of shoulder extension, as the lats have the best leverage in that position, which simply means that you want to pick an exercise that is the hardest in the shortened or contracted position of the movement. When performing these exercises, you want to keep specific form cues, so the target musculature, the lats, are the prime movers. Depress the scapula and keep it in place as much as it feels comfortable. Don't let the scapula move into protraction and into retraction. Keep them depressed, or your lats will end up looking depressed. Focus on really driving your elbows down into your hip bone and don't just pull back. Again, we're covering the shoulder extension component of the lats, which means that by mentally cueing yourself to pull back down into your hip bone, you can activate the lats more and disengage the upper back from doing any work. Keep your spine as neutral as possible, or you can even crunch down a bit, but don't extend your back, as this will allow other muscle groups to take over the movement. When doing this exercise unilaterally, use your bench or machine of choice and brace against it with as much force as possible to create maximum external and internal stability, which will maximize motor unit recruitment and mechanical tension, which are the 2 main mechanisms of hypertrophy. Now that you got the scientific and practical applications of getting your back as wide as fucking possible, you don't want to end up with a fucking Dorito back. Wide, but fucking thin. You want your back to be as dense and thick as possible, getting that demon back look. And for this, you want to look at the transverse plane pull. This is a simple horizontal but wider grip pull, which takes care of shoulder blade protraction and retraction, which the traps do, and also horizontal abduction of the humerus, which are the function of the rear delts. For the exercise options, you can pick any chest-supported row variation of your choice. When it comes to the resistance profile and when the upper back, the traps, the rear delts have the best leverage, you don't have to overthink that. It is not as important as it is for lat training, so just pick the exercise that feels most comfortable for you or which you have available and get as fucking strong at it as you can. But what matters to hit specific regions of the upper back, either the traps or the rear delt specifically, is how you perform that exercise. For a more upper back biased row, you want to fully protract your scapula on the eccentric and let it stretch the fuck out without your actual spine moving. Let the spine almost be neutral and locked into place while moving your scapula into protraction and retraction. Any additional crazy upper back stretch you get from completely rounding upper back over will not hit the upper back at all, but your spinal erectors. The actual range of motion that your scapula has in protraction is not as big as you think it is. When going into the concentric part of the movement, focus on really retracting your scapula as far back as possible. This will activate the traps maximally, as that's the fucking function of the muscle, and will slightly disengage the rear delts. If possible, use a machine and or implement that has a fixed handle and bar path, as this allows for a more natural use of the traps specifically and slightly disengages the rear delts, as your scapula wants to move inwards or wants to retract inwards, but if the handles move outwards, the rear delts take over the movement and the scapula and traps have less leverage to produce force. Now, if you want to do more rear delts bias row, you want to do the exact opposite. Use a machine and or implement that lets you diverge the handles, as this allows for a more natural use of the rear delts over the traps due to the increase of humeral horizontal abduction. Make sure to don't move the shoulder blades, as that's the function of the traps, and focus on solely pulling with your arms and shoulders while keeping your shoulder blades locked into place. Getting your upper back as thick as possible will certainly give you that demon back look, but to really get that detail and density in your physique, you need to have thick fucking spinal erectors, which you can only accomplish by bending over with heavy ass weights. For this, we'll be looking at hip hinge variations, the deadlift specifically. So the function of the spinal erectors are spinal flexion and extension. On a traditional hip hinge, you're not actively performing those functions, but resisting it with isometric contraction of your spinal erectors. But this isometric contraction is so fucking strong, it is literally keeping your spine from bending into two fucking halves. Exercise options for this movement category would be a stiff leg deadlift, which is the goat for spinal erectors growth. You could also add a deficit to this exercise to make it even more challenging, or do a different variation like the RDL, which is also a good option. These deadlift variations, due to you holding heavy ass weights in your hands while bending over, will also hit the upper back effectively through the weighted stretch. If you don't want to feel like a fucking zombie on a day-to-day life, you sadly cannot deadlift every fucking day. So you want to pick maybe a second variation of a hip hinge, which is lighter and lets you hit the spinal erectors with a better stimulus to fatigue ratio. For light spinal erector work, you can do good mornings, 45 degrees back extensions, GHD back extensions, or these crazy Jefferson and Zercher deadlift variations. But even if you're getting a better stimulus to fatigue ratio, be sure that if you're doing fucking heavy stiff leg deadlift, it will give you more growth than fucking back extension would, for the spinal erectors specifically. Because I can't discuss the form cues of every single variation, let's discuss the stiff leg deadlift, because it is the goat after all. Make sure to keep your hips and knees locked into place while completing the concentric with solely your spinal erectors. You can completely skip the eccentric or do it with a slightly faster tempo if it's a stiff leg deadlift. This is what Jordan Peters, the goat of spinal erector thickness, recommended to me personally. Make sure that if you're doing another deadlift or hip hinge variation, to use a slightly slower and controlled eccentric, as you're reversing the movement mid-air and you don't want to tear your shit up because you're dive bombing that shit. We've now covered every single function, exercise options, and also form cues for the main bread and butter movements to build a fucking huge back. But if you want to build your upper back or traps specifically, you want to look at shrug variations. The best option here would be a standard calto shrug on your chest support row of choice. Literally just perform shoulder protraction and retraction without moving your arms. Or you could do any vertical shrug of choice. Swim machine, single arm swim machine, power shrugs, doesn't matter. This will again take out the rear delts and other muscle groups of the upper back and solely focus on the traps, which will maximize motor unit recruitment and mechanical tension that the traps specifically get due to you disengaging every single other muscle group that could take over the movement. All of this information is fucking great, and I wish I had it when I started training, but you will not get any results if your programming fucking sucks. So here's a quick template you can use to program your back training effectively. And if you want to know the ins and outs of why I chose the sets, the rep range, the specific splits, make sure to check the video right here. Or you can apply for my coaching in the link down below, so I can explain it to you and program it personally for you. See you there, brother, in the next video.